The unease begins. The bus continued its journey, the murmur of voices filling the air, blending with the monotonous hum of the engine. A few passengers settled back into their seats, shaking their heads, dismissing the whole affair as an unnecessary disturbance. A few glanced at Ethan, who stood frozen by the aisle, still clutching his phone as if it could somehow undo the moment that had just transpired. Franklin remained silent, his eyes scanning the bus, calculating, as though nothing had happened. His grip on Amara's shoulder, though tight, was calm, almost too calm. But if anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the slight tension in the set of his jaw, the barely perceptible way his hand shifted just slightly, holding Amara firmly in place. Amara, for her part, seemed to retreat into herself even further. Her small frame seemed to collapse in on itself, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had crushed her spirit. Her hands, once so frantic and urgent in their signs, were now motionless in her lap, and her wide eyes stared blankly ahead, unblinking, almost as if she were trying to erase herself from the scene. The bus jerked again, its tires grinding against the uneven pavement, making the passengers feel the slightest shift in their seats. In the middle of this oppressive silence, the sound of Amara's soft, trembling breath was the only thing that marked her presence. She wasn't crying, she didn't even look upset in the traditional sense. It was as though a part of her had resigned to a fate she couldn't control. But her eyes, those dark, anxious eyes, were a different story. They were full of unsaid words, a plea for help that went unanswered, a silent scream no one could hear. Ethan couldn't tear his gaze from her. Something inside him twisted painfully, a sense of wrongness gnawing at him. He could still see her hands moving, the way they waved, then stopped, then twitched again, as though the signs were clear, yet no one could understand them. His heart thudded harder in his chest as he replayed what had just happened. The police had arrived, yes, but Franklin had presented the documents so smoothly, so efficiently, that even the officer had hesitated to question them. He knew what he had seen, the signs, the silent plea, but the legal papers had wiped away any doubt. Ethan's fingers flexed around the phone in his hand, his knuckles white with the pressure. It felt like the moment was slipping away, like he was losing his chance to help her. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Why had Franklin brought her on the bus? Where were they going? And most importantly, who was Amara really? The other passengers had returned to their own business, some scowling at Ethan, others muttering under their breath, annoyed by the interruption. It was clear that he had become the villain of the story, the troublemaker who had wasted their time. The bus hummed with the uncomfortable quiet of those who had no interest in questioning authority or digging deeper. They were content with what they had been told, and they wanted nothing more than to go back to their routine. But Ethan couldn't let it go. He couldn't simply sit back and pretend everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. He glanced again at Franklin, sitting there with his implacable expression, his eyes hidden behind the mask of indifference. There was something unsettling about him, something calculating in the way he held Amara, as if he were her keeper, her jailer. His presence was cold, like the calm before a storm that, Ethan feared, might never come. Ethan knew the signs. He had seen them before, growing up with a mother who communicated through them. She had taught him how to read the language of the hands, how to understand the unspoken words that danced in the air. Amara wasn't just twitching her hands. She was signing, desperately, trying to tell someone, anyone, that she needed help. But what kind of help? Who was this man beside her, and why had he brought her here, to a bus full of strangers? His mind couldn't rest. His fingers gripped the edge of the seat in front of him, and he leaned forward, his voice low but steady, enough for only Franklin to hear. "I'm not letting this go," he whispered. "You'll regret this." Franklin didn't respond. He didn't need to. The quiet confidence in his silence was louder than words. His grip on Amara tightened ever so slightly, a warning, perhaps, or a show of control. She flinched under his touch, but she said nothing. A sense of helplessness rose in Ethan's chest. His eyes darted from Amara to Franklin and back again. How could he have been so sure that something was wrong, yet be powerless to prove it? Suddenly, the bus took a sharp turn, jolting Ethan out of his spiraling thoughts. The passengers around him barely reacted to the motion, lost in their own distractions. But Ethan, still standing in the aisle, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened before the police arrived, the way Amara's hands had moved so desperately, trying to communicate something beyond the scope of what anyone else had understood. And then, just as his thoughts began to swirl into a whirlpool of frustration, something happened. Amara's hands began to move again. Slowly at first, but with a deliberate purpose that seemed to bring the world around her into sharp focus. Her fingers curled into a tight fist before extending out, her movements a quiet dance of desperation, as if she were trying to send a message not just to the people on the bus, but to someone beyond the confines of this aging vehicle. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift, an unmistakable rhythm in her signs. He moved closer, leaning over the row of seats to get a better look. His eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening as he caught a familiar sign, one he knew all too well. She was asking for help. But not just help. She was signing for freedom. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world outside the bus blurred into nothingness as Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. Franklin, unaware of Ethan's renewed focus, kept his eyes ahead, his expression unchanged. Amara's hands trembled, but the signs were clear. She wasn't just asking for help. She was pleading for escape. Ethan's resolve solidified in an instant. He could no longer remain passive. This wasn't about just one girl, this was about a story that didn't end here, a truth that needed to be uncovered, no matter the consequences. He had to act, and he had to act now. There was still time. He had to make sure the world knew the truth about what was happening on this bus. About who Amara really was. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on his phone again, and dialed once more. This time, though, his voice was steady and filled with a certainty that could not be shaken. He wouldn't stop until he knew for sure. 911, this is an emergency, he said, his voice unwavering. I need immediate help. I believe a child is in danger, and I need someone to act before it's too late. The shifting tension. The bus rumbled onward, oblivious to the tension that simmered between its passengers. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the road, the occasional creaking of the overhead lights, and the low murmur of idle conversations formed the backdrop to the silent drama unfolding in the aisle. The weight of anticipation hung in the air, suffocating and thick. Ethan's eyes never left Amara. Her hands, so frail and small, trembled in the space between them, her fingers forming shapes in the air, pulling Ethan deeper into her silent world. The fluidity of her movements, though subtle, was unmistakable. She wasn't just seeking help, she was trying to communicate a message, a warning. Something far bigger than the man sitting beside her, than the bus that carried them all. She was trying to break free from the silent chains that held her captive. Ethan's mind raced as he watched her. The signs were so clear to him now, each movement spelling out her need for escape, for release from Franklin's control. His hands tightened around the phone in his grip, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit back and allow this to unfold without challenging it. The cold, eerie calm that radiated from Franklin, the way he held Amara with an unnerving grip, spoke volumes. This wasn't just an ordinary trip, an ordinary bus ride. This was something darker, something far more sinister. The moment stretched on, excruciating in their silence. The rest of the passengers seemed to be lost in their own worlds, none of them noticing the escalating tension in the aisle. Some were buried in their phones, others engaged in hushed conversations, too absorbed in their lives to see the subtle cues that Ethan had picked up. The world moved forward around him, but Ethan felt as if time had slowed down, each second drawing him closer to the edge of a precipice. His mind flashed back to his own mother. How many times had he sat beside her, watching her hands move as she signed in the quiet of their home. Her graceful, precise movements were more than just words, they were emotions, thoughts, pleas that had no voice but hers. Ethan had learned the language of the hands early on, and it had shaped the way he saw the world. He'd never questioned the importance of communication, of truly listening to someone when they were trying to tell you something. And right now, Amara was screaming for help in the only way she could. But Franklin, ever the picture of control, didn't seem to care. His cold, emotionless stare never left the horizon out the bus window. He was too focused on maintaining the illusion of normalcy, too intent on convincing everyone that this was just a typical, mundane bus ride. His eyes flicked momentarily to Ethan, but they didn't hold any real emotion. It was as if he saw Ethan, saw everyone else, as nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. Amara's eyes flickered up, locking with Ethan's for the briefest of moments, and it was then that Ethan understood. There was a connection, something unspoken between them, as if she was entrusting him with her truth. She wasn't just a scared child sitting next to a stranger, she was a person, a victim, a soul in desperate need of a lifeline. The urgency in Ethan's heart grew, like a pulse beating faster and faster in his chest. His fingers hovered over the phone screen as he prepared to dial again. He had to get this right. He had to make them believe him, make them understand that this wasn't some misinterpretation of a simple gesture. This was real. This was happening. He pressed the screen, his finger trembling slightly as the phone rang. A moment passed, then another, and the familiar voice of a dispatcher broke through the tension. 911, what is your emergency? Ethan's voice was steady, but beneath it, there was an undercurrent of fear. Fear for Amara. Fear for what might happen if he didn't act fast enough. I'm on a bus, he began, his words deliberate. There's a child who's being held against her will. I believe she's being abducted, and I need you to send someone immediately. I have reason to believe the man she's with is not her guardian. The dispatcher's tone was immediate, concerned. Stay on the line with me, sir. Can you describe the situation? Ethan's eyes darted back to Franklin, who still hadn't reacted, still seemed oblivious to the growing tension in the air. His voice was calm, methodical, but his grip on Amara's shoulder was unmistakably firm. I'm on a bus heading eastbound on Route 32, Ethan said quickly, glancing around the bus. The girl is seated next to a man, middle-aged, white, in a gray suit. She's a young black girl, maybe around 9 years old, and she's trying to communicate. She's using sign language. I'm certain she's trying to ask for help. The dispatcher responded in a steady, professional tone. We've received your call, and officers are on their way. Please remain where you are, and stay on the phone with me until they arrive. I need you to try to keep calm. Ethan's hand shook slightly as he held the phone to his ear. The bus lurched again, taking a sharp turn, and he felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into his chest. He glanced at the other passengers, who seemed oblivious to the crisis unfolding around them. Their lives, their worlds, were untouched by the silent plea that hung in the air. They were passengers in a moment they had no interest in understanding. Franklin finally broke his silence, his voice a low murmur. You really think you can stop this, kid? His tone wasn't one of anger but of something far colder, calm, detached, as if he had already written the outcome of this situation in his mind. Ethan didn't respond at first. He didn't need to. He could feel the chill of Franklin's words, but it only fueled his resolve. The truth had to come out, no matter how hard it was. No matter how much Franklin tried to control the narrative. Amara's hands twitched again, a flurry of signs in the air, more urgent this time. Ethan felt his heart lurch in his chest. He couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He couldn't just sit back and let this man get away with whatever he was doing to her. The dispatcher's voice crackled in his ear, and he forced himself to focus, to stay calm. Help is on the way, the dispatcher assured him, but Ethan's gaze never wavered from Franklin. Please stay on the line, and if you feel at any time that you are in immediate danger, we will send officers faster." As the minutes ticked by, the bus rolled forward, its destination unknown. But to Ethan, the destination had already been set. There was no turning back now. There was no walking away from this. Not until Amara was safe. Not until Franklin's facade cracked, and the truth came out. The weight of the moment pressed down harder than ever, but Ethan was resolute. The police were coming, but he knew he couldn't wait for them to solve everything. It was up to him, and now, more than ever, he could feel the sense of urgency that would carry him through the storm. Amara needed him. And he wasn't going to stop until she was free. The tightening grip. The hum of the bus's engine seemed louder than ever, filling the space around Ethan and Amara with an oppressive, mechanical rhythm. The other passengers remained oblivious to the unfolding drama. It was as though they were trapped in their own little bubbles, disconnected from the reality of what was happening around them. The gentle swaying of the bus, the occasional creaking of metal, the soft murmur of idle chatter, none of it registered. Not for Ethan. Not for Amara. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. His thumb hovered anxiously over the screen, his gaze never straying far from Amara. He watched as her hands trembled with a quiet urgency, her fingers forming signs in the air. She wasn't just waving. She wasn't simply moving her hands out of habit or confusion. No. Ethan had seen it before, his mother had taught him to recognize it, a desperate plea for help. Each motion was calculated, each flick of her fingers deliberate. She was signing, speaking in the only language she knew how, trying to break free from the grip of a silent predator. Franklin, however, seemed entirely unfazed. The man sitting beside her, his suit rumpled, his face gaunt, appeared lost in his own thoughts. His cold, empty eyes never left the window, his hand still pressing down firmly on Amara's shoulder. There was a disturbing calm about him, as though he believed that no one would challenge him, that no one could see through his web of lies. But Ethan saw it. He saw through Franklin's veneer, the way his eyes flickered, just for a split second, when he first noticed Ethan's stare. The man was nervous. And that made Ethan's resolve only stronger. Ethan's phone was still pressed tightly against his ear. The dispatcher's calm voice echoed in the background, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance, but Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His focus was on Amara, on her movements. The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest, and with every passing second, the air felt heavier. He needed to make sure the authorities understood how urgent this was. He had to make them see it, the truth behind Amara's silent cries for help. He could feel the unease bubbling inside him as the seconds ticked by. Each second was another second that Amara might be in danger. The police were still on their way, but what if they didn't arrive in time? What if Franklin had already planned an escape? What if this was all just part of some twisted game? But before he could spiral further into the uncertainty, Amara's eyes met his again. This time, there was a flicker of something different, a spark of hope, a silent plea for him to keep going. Her wide, anxious eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he knew with a fierce certainty, he couldn't stop. He couldn't back down now. He was the only one who saw it, the only one who understood. "Please, don't let him take me," Amara's eyes seemed to whisper, the words unspoken but clear in her gaze. Ethan's heart clenched painfully in his chest, and he felt a surge of anger rush through him. This man, this monster, was trying to take her from the world, from safety. He had to be stopped. Franklin couldn't be allowed to continue his cruel game. Not with Amara. Not with anyone. The tension in the air felt unbearable. It was as though every breath was strained, every heartbeat measured. Ethan glanced around at the passengers, hoping that someone, anyone, would notice, would step in, but they were still too absorbed in their own worlds. Too comfortable in their own lives to notice the child's silent desperation. Franklin shifted beside Amara, his grip tightening ever so slightly. Amara flinched at the pressure, her shoulders stiffening. Ethan's jaw clenched. He couldn't wait any longer. The police had to be here soon, but in the meantime, he couldn't just sit idly by. He made a decision. With one last glance at Amara, who was still desperately signing for help, Ethan stood up, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bus like a sharp knife. "I'm not going to let this happen." The words hung in the air, and for the briefest of moments, everything stopped. The bus seemed to freeze, the other passengers turning to look at him as if he had spoken in a language they didn't understand. But none of that mattered. Not now. Franklin's gaze snapped to him, cold and calculating, like a wolf finally noticing the lamb that had wandered too far from the flock. His eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin, dismissive smile. He stood up slowly, a quiet menace emanating from his every movement. There was something in his posture, something rigid and controlled, that made Ethan's blood run cold. "You should stay out of this, kid." Franklin's voice was low, but there was an edge to it now. The calm facade was cracking, revealing something darker beneath. "You don't know what you're getting into." Ethan didn't flinch. He held his ground. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. You're not taking her anywhere." Franklin stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Ethan's with the weight of authority. "You don't want to make this a bigger problem than it already is," he said, his voice laced with a threatening undertone. "I don't care if you're a child or not. Stay out of it." Ethan swallowed hard, his resolve unshaken. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. He couldn't back down now. "I'm calling the police," he said, his voice steady. "I already have. And I'm not letting you walk away with her." The air seemed to vibrate with the tension between them. For a moment, it felt like the entire bus had held its breath, waiting for something to break. The other passengers looked between Ethan and Franklin, unsure of how to react, unsure of whose side to take. Ethan didn't care about them. His eyes were only on Amara, and he could see the flicker of hope growing in her gaze. She was starting to believe. Starting to see that someone was willing to fight for her. And that, more than anything, was what kept Ethan going. Franklin, however, didn't share that same belief. His grip on Amara's shoulder tightened, his knuckles turning white as he tried to pull her closer to him, as if she were a prize he couldn't afford to lose. He glanced over his shoulder at the driver, who seemed frozen in indecision, unsure of what was happening. The driver was just as helpless as the rest of the passengers, unsure whether to intervene or just let the situation play out. Ethan's breath quickened, but he didn't back down. He had no choice now but to stand firm. The truth was out there, but it needed to be spoken. He needed to show them all that he wasn't just a child playing at heroism. He was a witness to something bigger. Something that could not be ignored. The bus continued its relentless roll down the highway, but to Ethan, it felt like the world had stopped turning. And then, from somewhere outside, the unmistakable sound of sirens broke through the tension. The police were finally here. But was it too late? Would Amara be freed before Franklin could slip away? Would the truth finally come to light, or would it all remain locked in a silent struggle between predator and prey? Ethan's heart raced as he prepared for the confrontation that would define the course of the rest of his life. He knew one thing for sure, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The moment of truth. The sound of the sirens grew louder, growing closer to the bus with each passing second. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, matching the rapid rhythm of his pulse. His eyes flickered back and forth between Franklin and Amara, who sat motionless, her gaze still locked on him. A mix of fear and hope lingered in her eyes, a silent plea that seemed to cut through the tension surrounding them. Franklin, on the other hand, appeared unruffled. Despite the mounting pressure, he gave no indication of panic. He was a man accustomed to controlling the situation, and nothing, least of all a 10-year-old boy, was going to throw him off course. The bus driver glanced nervously in his rearview mirror, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He was no longer just the driver, he was a witness to something far bigger than he ever expected to be part of. But what could he do? His voice was too soft to reach the passengers now. His hesitation was obvious. If the authorities arrived and found that Franklin was truly innocent, then he could be in just as much trouble as Ethan. The bus rolled to a gradual stop as it pulled over to the side of the road. Outside, the flashing blue and red lights of the police cars lit up the space, casting sharp shadows across the asphalt. 2 squad cars had arrived, their officers quickly stepping out, hands resting near their holsters, but not yet drawing their weapons. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, strode toward the bus, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though looking for any sign of trouble. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, watching the officer approach. The entire atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. Every second felt like an eternity. Ethan couldn't afford to mess this up now. He couldn't let Franklin slip away. Not when Amara was so close to freedom. The officer reached the steps of the bus and motioned for the driver to open the door. The driver hesitated for a moment, then pressed the button to allow the door to swing open, allowing the officer to step inside. "Is everything okay here, folks?" the officer asked, his voice authoritative but calm. Ethan didn't wait for anyone else to speak. He could feel the weight of the moment, the urgency of what needed to happen. "This man is not her guardian," he blurted out, pointing directly at Franklin. "He's kidnapping her. She's been asking for help the entire time." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the bus. Some of the passengers, who had been merely observing up until that point, now shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between Ethan and Franklin. But no one dared speak up, not yet. Franklin's face didn't change. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips curling into that same cold smile as he turned to face the officer. The hand on Amara's shoulder remained unyielding, a silent warning that anyone who challenged him would face his wrath. The officer took a moment to size up the situation. He glanced at Franklin, then at Ethan, then at Amara. The tension in the air was palpable, but the officer remained composed. He didn't immediately rush to judgment. Instead, he nodded and turned to the bus driver. "I need to see the passenger manifest." "And you, sir," he said, turning to Franklin, "I'll need to see some identification and any paperwork you have regarding your guardianship of this child." Franklin's expression remained calm as he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a set of papers, handing them over to the officer with a slow, measured movement. The officer took the documents, flipping through them briefly. Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming. Franklin had planned for this. He was prepared. He had anticipated every move. The officer scanned the papers, then looked up at Franklin with a slight nod. "Everything seems to be in order," the officer said, his voice almost apologetic, as if this was just another routine stop. "Your guardianship papers are legitimate. I'm afraid I can't do anything about this unless there's some proof of wrongdoing." Ethan felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. He had known this might happen. Franklin was too prepared. The papers were real. They couldn't be contested so easily. But Ethan couldn't stop now. He couldn't back down. Amara was counting on him. "No. No, that's not right." Ethan's voice cracked with the strain of the moment, but he held his ground. "She's signing. She's trying to tell you something. She's asking for help. Please, you have to believe me." The officer looked at him with a mixture of concern and confusion. His gaze flickered between Ethan and Amara, who sat eerily still, her wide eyes locked on the officer, her hands trembling in her lap. Franklin's grip on her shoulder tightened again, but Amara didn't flinch. She was still too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to speak up. The quiet desperation in her eyes spoke volumes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the officer seemed to hesitate. But then Franklin spoke, his voice smooth and unruffled. "The child is clearly confused," he said, his tone laced with false concern. "She has a condition. It's called Parkinson's, a neurological disorder. She can't communicate properly because of it. You'll see that I'm taking her to her treatment." He turned to the officer, offering him a pleasant smile. "If you'd like, you can verify that with her doctor." The officer paused. He glanced at Amara again, her fingers curling nervously around the fabric of her dress. He seemed to weigh the situation, his face unreadable. Ethan could feel the tension mounting again, every second dragging out like a battle of wills. But then, unexpectedly, the officer spoke again. "We're going to need to take a closer look at this," he said, his voice firm. He motioned to his partner, who had been standing outside the bus, to come inside. "Sir, step aside. We'll be conducting a search." Franklin's eyes flickered with something darker, a shift in his posture. He had been so sure of his control, but now there was a crack in the facade. For the first time, a subtle flicker of concern passed over his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" Franklin asked, his voice tightening, though he tried to maintain a mask of calm. The officer didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Franklin's with quiet authority. He spoke as though he was already making up his mind. "We'll see about that. Please step aside while we confirm everything." Franklin hesitated, his jaw clenched, but he eventually stepped back, allowing the officer to approach Amara. The young girl, though visibly terrified, didn't move, and for the first time since the bus ride began, she looked like she was finally being seen. The officer crouched down beside her, speaking gently, trying to offer some comfort. "Hey there, sweetheart," the officer said softly. "We're going to make sure everything is all right, okay? You're safe now." Amara's eyes flickered to him, a spark of hope flaring in her gaze. She couldn't speak, but her eyes said everything. For the first time, she wasn't alone. For the first time, someone had listened. The officer gently placed a hand on her shoulder and then turned to his partner, who had entered the bus and began speaking into his radio. The minutes dragged on, but Ethan's heart felt lighter with each passing second. He wasn't sure how it would all play out, but for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance to make a difference. The turning point. The bus remained eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft murmur of the officers speaking to one another. Outside, the flashing police lights cast long, jagged shadows across the sidewalk, painting everything in hues of blue and red. Ethan stood still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breath coming in shallow, nervous gasps. He couldn't let himself relax, not yet. The battle wasn't over. There was still too much at stake. Amara's wide eyes flickered nervously, but for the first time since the chaos began, she seemed more alert. The officer's gentle words, the slight touch on her shoulder, seemed to calm her in a way nothing else had. There was no immediate threat here, not yet, anyway. Ethan could see the tension draining from her body, a small sigh escaping her lips as she sat back in her seat, trying to breathe easier. Franklin, on the other hand, had grown increasingly stiff, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask of calm that betrayed a faint trace of anger. The soft rustle of the paperwork in his hands echoed loudly in the otherwise silent space. His grip on his briefcase tightened, his knuckles widening as though he was trying to control the panic building beneath his stoic expression. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Franklin knew something the officers didn't. He was too composed, too practiced. Ethan had seen enough to know that there were people in the world who could manipulate any system, twist any truth. And Franklin was one of them. But he couldn't let that stop him, not now. He had to trust the officers to see what he saw, the truth. The second officer, a younger man with a stern face and arms crossed over his chest, stepped closer to Franklin, holding the documents in his hands with a certain wariness. The older officer continued to crouch beside Amara, his expression softening as he engaged her in quiet conversation. Ethan couldn't make out their words, but he could see the officer's reassuring smile, his attempts to communicate that they were trying to help. But it wasn't just that smile that reassured Ethan. It was the shift in the air, the sense that things were starting to turn in their favor. For the first time since they'd boarded the bus, there was the possibility of hope. "Everything okay, Amara?" the officer asked quietly, trying to catch her gaze. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers still twitching, uncertain whether to trust him fully. Ethan could almost hear her thoughts, the years of fear and distrust now battling against the growing sense of safety she might feel in this small moment. Amara's fingers began to move, slow and deliberate, though her body was stiff with the uncertainty of the situation. The officer didn't rush her. He waited patiently, allowing her the time she needed. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he watched Amara, her hands trembling as she formed the familiar shapes in the air. It was a subtle movement, the kind of sign language Ethan had learned to recognize years ago. His mother, who had been deaf since birth, had taught him and his siblings how to sign, how to communicate without speaking. But that was just it, he had recognized it immediately. The signs she was making were pleading. They weren't random, they weren't the usual signs for basic needs. No, Amara was asking for something specific, something urgent. "I need help," her hands spelled out. It was simple. It was clear. And yet, the word struck Ethan like a bolt of lightning. The officer beside her didn't understand the full meaning of the signs, but he seemed to catch on quickly. His eyes flicked to Ethan, whose own gaze was burning with intensity. The young officer looked back to Amara, his brow furrowed in thought. It was as though something had clicked in his mind, though it wasn't clear exactly what had changed. He straightened up and addressed Franklin once more. "Sir, I need to ask you again," the officer began, his voice measured and calm. "We've been doing our due diligence, but something about this situation doesn't sit right. This child," he paused, trying to phrase his next words carefully, "she's trying to communicate something. And based on the signs, it looks like she's in distress. If you're truly her guardian, why not allow us to verify her condition with a doctor? We'll make it quick." Franklin's jaw tightened at the officer's words. He took a step forward, his shoulders squared. "There's no need for further delay," he snapped, his voice cold and dismissive. "I have provided all the necessary documentation. This child is under my care, and I am taking her to receive treatment. I don't see why we need to drag this out." But the officer's eyes had already shifted back to Amara. She had stopped signing for a moment, her hands dropping to her lap, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a silent desperation, a quiet but fierce need for help that no amount of paperwork could erase. And the officer could see it. "I'm not asking for your permission, sir," the officer said slowly, his tone now firm. "I'm telling you that we need to speak with a medical professional immediately. If you are indeed her guardian, you should have no problem with that." Franklin stood frozen for a moment, his eyes narrowing, his face betraying no emotion as he weighed his options. It was clear that this wasn't part of his plan. Ethan could almost see the calculations running through Franklin's mind, the fleeting glimmer of uncertainty crossing his face. He had been confident up until this point, but now, the cracks were beginning to show. "I'm her legal guardian," Franklin repeated, his voice strained, though his demeanor remained controlled. "I've already provided the necessary paperwork. She's fine. I've got everything under control." But Amara's eyes told a different story. For the briefest of moments, she looked directly at Ethan, her gaze intense and pleading. There was something about that look, something that reached into Ethan's soul and told him he couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close. He had to make this work. He had to make them listen. And then, just as the tension in the air seemed to grow unbearable, a voice broke through the quiet. "Wait." It was a woman's voice, one of the other passengers, a middle-aged woman with graying hair who had been silent for most of the ride. She had been watching the situation unfold, her eyes flicking from Amara to the officers and back. "I've been watching," she said softly, her voice trembling. She's been trying to signal for help. She's not just twitching. She's asking for something. She's desperate. You can't ignore that. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. For the first time, someone, another adult, a stranger, was speaking up. And it wasn't just any stranger. It was a woman who had seen what Ethan had seen, someone who had noticed the same signs. Thank you, Ethan breathed, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with gratitude. It was a small thing, but it was enough to tip the balance. The officer turned to the woman, nodding thoughtfully. We're going to look into this, ma'am. Don't worry. Franklin's eyes flickered briefly to the woman, a look of pure disdain flashing across his face, but he quickly masked it. It wasn't enough to intimidate the officer or the passengers anymore. The truth was beginning to unravel. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they could win. But they still weren't out of the woods yet. The officers were closing in on the truth, and Franklin was running out of options.